Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much. I'd like to start off by thanking Matthews and IPS for the kind invitation for me to come and speak to you. In some ways, I have the easiest job to do because I'm sure that Singaporeans know Malaysia very well. So basically, I'm just giving a summary of the latest trend in Malaysia, especially what I call the rise of political Islam. So basically what I want to do in my 15 minutes is basically talk about the sources of political Islam in Malaysia. And I think it's important that we identify the sources as coming from two areas. One is the formal sources, but I think a lot of people, when they look at Malaysia, they forget about the informal source of political Islam. Then I want to talk a bit about the pressure points, why it is so difficult to deal with this issue, and finally I'll provide a very brief summary of what I think. So I'd like to start off by saying that when I talk about political Islam here, I'm not really talking about Islam as a religion, but I'm really talking about politicians in Malaysia who are using Islam to mobilize the polity, specifically the Muslim community there. Basically, these politicians are using Islam as the only platform to gather support from the Muslim community and the wider Malaysian community. So when I talk about the formal sources of political Islam, I think the starting point really has to be the Malaysian Constitution. I think if you look at it closely, no matter how you come up, whether you're a constitutional lawyer, political scientist, or even a layman, in terms of the Malaysian Constitution, you really can't separate the Malay identity with Islam. Part of it has got to do with the fact that it's written very clearly in the Constitution that, if you are a Muslim in Malaysia, you're also a Malay, and there's no way around it. The other problem is, in the Malaysian Constitution, it says very clearly that Islam is the religion of federation, but the problem is that very often the second part is not taken into account. So what you have is, Islam is the religion of federation, but other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the federation. But the problem in Malaysia is that very often, people only talk about the first part of the sentence, which is Islam is the religion of the federation. And in practice, they take it to mean that Islam is actually the official religion. Now, I would argue that if this is the case, the framers of the Constitution who made it very clear that Islam is the official religion, but they did not use the phrase. They used the phrase that Islam is the religion of the federation. Thus, what we have in Malaysia, from the constitutional viewpoint, is that a Malay is equal to a Muslim, equals to a special position, because Islam is the religion of federation, and therefore, the thinking is that Islam is also the official religion. In other words, being a Malay means that you are higher than all other peoples of Malaysia. And this is reinforced by all the major Muslim majority political parties in Malaysia. And of course here, I'm talking about UMNO, the former ruling party who's been in power for 61 years. I'm also talking about PAS, Party Islam Malaysia. From the name alone, it's very clear where they stand. And of course, the new ruling party in Malaysia, Bersatu. Now, looking back in history, or contemporary history, we really have to look at the role of UMNO. UMNO was basically the de facto ruling party in Malaysia, despite the fact that officially they called themselves the Malay Alliance, and after that the Barisan Nasional. But in actual practice, they were basically the ruling party. They don't really care about what the other component parties in the ruling coalition wants. Now, when you talk about the rise of political Islam, you really have to look back in the 1980s. And the starting point really has to be 1981, when Mahathir came into power. Mahathir very early on knew that he really had accumulated a lot of political power because he was a man in a hurry. I always regarded Mahathir as a true nationalist. He really wanted to develop Malaysia and make sure Malaysia was a fully developed country. And he understood that in order to do that, he really needed to accumulate real political power. And he also saw correctly during the 1980s that his major threat to his accumulation of power, of course, was Party Islam Malaysia. And therefore, to play the game, in order to beat PAS, he really had to bring in Islam. And he did this in a very clever way. He looked around and see who was the person who can really mobilize the Islamic ground. And of course, the answer was Anwar Ibrahim. So that's the reason why he brought Anwar Ibrahim into government. And he inserted Islam into the public administration of the country. But more importantly, during his first term in government, he established a lot of Islamic-related institutions. I don't want to go through the list, but the major ones is such as the Islamic University, Islamic banking. But probably the most important element that he introduced, or establishment institution that he established, was of course JAKIM, which is the Department of Islamic Development in Malaysia. Now, what is really interesting about JAKIM is that since then, JAKIM has accumulated a lot of power. If you speak to people in Malaysia, especially in civil service, they will tell you that JAKIM really is a special part of the civil service. They have lots of autonomy, and essentially they do what they want. But the really important thing about JAKIM is that they're trying to promote this idea of a Malay Islamic state. Now, this is really, really interesting because those of you who knows anything about Islam know that Islam has no racial character. But they're trying to build this idea that, in Malaysia, the situation is unique, and that we're trying to build this thing called a Malay Islamic state. The other really important thing about JAKIM, of course, is that they're trying to bureaucratize Islam. Again, this is, I'm not saying it's unique to Malaysia, but the way JAKIM has gone about it is quite interesting because they come up with all sorts of rules and regulations. Now, I'm not only talking about personal behavior, but they're talking about rules and regulations that covers every facet of Muslim life. So one of the unusual things you'll find in the civil service, say compared to the 60s and 70s Malaysia now, is that many departmental heads in Malaysia, and government service in Malaysia now, you are put under tremendous pressure to organize religious stuff, which did not happen before. Okay, so the end game is that you create sort of an intolerant climate, as the speakers in the first panel has mentioned, the idea of us versus others. But this comes from the bureaucracy itself within the government. So I think we have a problem there, and the attitude is that, it's us against them. And as the speakers in the first panel has mentioned, the major targets are people who disagree with them or who don't go along with the idea of a Malay Islamic state, which is the non-Muslim community. But also, there's also a lot of intolerance over the non-Muslim population in Malaysia. And I'm sure you all know, Malaysia, almost 1/3 of the population are actually non-Muslims. Now, moving very quickly on to the role of PAS. Now, PAS, as the name suggests, Parti Islam Malaysia, has always had this idea of trying to create Negara Islam from day one. So they've always used Islam as a platform to mobilize support in the Malay community. Now, what is really interesting about PAS is that during the time when Mahathir began to assert himself as Islamic leader, right, PAS began to create all sorts of fringe groups and supported all sorts of NGOs in Malaysia as long as these Islamic NGOs went against the government. So today, if you look at PAS, right, what is really interesting about PAS is not so much their Islamic party, but their extensive links. If you look at the leadership of PAS, you find that many of the leaders of PAS have extensive links with Islamic NGOs. And a lot of them actually, before they entered PAS, they were actually founders of these NGOs. So the end game of this competition between UMNO and PAS, I would argue, is that they basically push the Malay polity to the right. There's no other space in the Malay polity in Malaysia other than being an Islamic champion. So that's the former political parties govern the ruling party. Now, the really interesting part, and this is the area that's been understudied in Malaysia, is the informal pressure of political Islam in Malaysia. And this is the rise of Islamic NGOs. Now, one of the key speakers in the first session talked about Saudi Arabia pouring a lot of money overseas. And Malaysia is one of the countries in Southeast Asia that's actually received a lot of this money. This money went to individuals. A lot of Malaysians actually received a lot of scholarships to study in Saudi Arabia. We know quite a number of them when they came back, they set out their own private madrasa. Some of them got involved with Salafi and Wahhabi teachings. I don't want to go into details, but the point I'm trying to make is that, a lot of these things about the rise of political Islam in Malaysia, not only from the government side, but the informal side, there's an external dynamic.